They say no one truly knows the person they marry. But Claire learned this truth in a way no heart could ever prepare for. On the night she walked into her future, dressed in soft ivory lace and holding every fragile hope she had left, she believed she had finally found safety, a man who treated her gently, listened when life grew heavy, and held her hand as if it were the most precious thing he had ever touched. She trusted him in a way she hadn't trusted anyone since losing her mother. Yet hours after signing her vows, she would stand in a darkened room, shivering, staring at a figure that looked like her groom, moved like him, spoke like him, but was not him. And once she realized the truth, it was already too late to turn back. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. People still talk about what happened to Claire as if the town itself is afraid to let the story fade. Some call it superstition, others call it a warning, but those who truly knew her insist she was never the type to imagine things. She was grounded, steady, the kind of woman who paid her bills early and kept promises even when they hurt. And that is why her story unsettles so many, because if someone as level-headed as Claire could fall into something she didn't understand, what does that mean for the rest of us? What really happened inside that house after the wedding guests left? Why did her husband never appear in photographs? Why did he vanish each dawn without explanation? And what truth did she uncover that nearly cost her everything? Stay with this story, because the answers don't arrive gently. They arrive like a door creaking open in the middle of the night. Long before the wedding, long before anyone whispered about strange events in Claire's life, she lived quietly in a small New England town, tucked between pine forests and lakes that froze thick in winter. Her days were simple. She opened her little bookstore at 9, brewed a pot of cinnamon-scented coffee, arranged the second-hand novels just the way her mother had taught her, and greeted the handful of regulars who found comfort in the quaintness of her shop. She wasn't unhappy, but she carried a heaviness, a quiet loneliness that settled into her bones after her mother passed away 3 years earlier. She often found herself staring at the doorway, half expecting the familiar sound of keys jingling or her mother calling her name with that soft, warm tone Claire had memorized since childhood. Her life wasn't broken, but it wasn't full either, and she accepted that with the kind of resignation that makes a person stop hoping for surprises. Claire's world shifted the evening Michael first stepped into her bookstore, as quietly as a page turning in an old forgotten novel. She noticed him because he carried himself with a calmness that didn't match the usual hurried rhythm of town life. He asked about a book on regional folklore, his voice steady, almost thoughtful, and Claire found herself listening more closely than she intended. They spoke for nearly an hour, not just about stories, but about routine things like the comfort of early mornings and the way certain memories return when you least expect them. He wasn't overly charming or dramatic, he simply felt present, the kind of presence that fills a room in a warm, ordinary way. When he left, Claire stood behind the counter longer than she meant to, staring at the door and wondering why a stranger's simple kindness lingered in her chest like a reminder of something she thought she'd lost. Over the next weeks, Michael became a familiar part of her days. He always arrived during quiet hours, when sunlight softened the wooden floors and the bookstore smelled faintly of vanilla from the old paper. Sometimes he brought Claire a cup of tea from the cafe across the street, insisting she shouldn't work long hours without something warm to hold. Other times he asked about her mother's favorite novels, listening with a patience that made Claire feel seen in ways she hadn't felt in years. She didn't fall for him suddenly, it happened in small moments, the way he remembered details she never expected anyone to care about, the way he never pushed for more than she was ready to give, the way he looked at her as though she mattered in a world where she'd grown used to feeling invisible. By early winter, Claire realized she wasn't lonely anymore, though she didn't yet understand why that realization frightened her. Michael eventually asked if he could take her to dinner, not with grand gestures but with a quiet sincerity that made her chest warm. They spent the evening at a small diner near the edge of town, sharing stories about their childhoods. Claire noticed he spoke very little about his past, always redirecting gently, as if those memories were fragile or distant, but she didn't press him. Instead, she told him about the nights she and her mother would read by lamplight, the two of them wrapped in soft blankets during winter storms, finding comfort in old stories. Michael listened with an expression she couldn't quite read, part admiration, part longing, part something she couldn't name. When he walked her home, he paused beneath the porch light and said, "Thank you for letting me in." Claire felt a tremor of emotion move through her, unexpected and deep. She didn't know it then, but that moment would be one she replayed countless times later, searching for signs she hadn't known how to see. As winter deepened, Claire and Michael fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural, though she occasionally sensed something unspoken in the pauses between his words. There were evenings when he seemed distracted, as if listening to something far away, and moments when his eyes appeared filled with a sadness she couldn't explain. Still, he never made her feel uncertain about his affection. He helped her close the shop on snowy nights, carried heavy boxes without her asking, and always walked her home even when she insisted she'd be fine. Claire began to look forward to their quiet walks more than she admitted. For the first time in years, she had someone who cared about her comfort, her thoughts, her laughter. Neighbors noticed the change in her. She smiled more, worked with more energy, even hummed softly while arranging new arrivals. Love was returning to her life gently, without warning, and she welcomed it wholeheartedly. One evening, after a long day of customers and deliveries, Claire found Michael waiting outside the shop with a nervousness she rarely saw in him. He held a small box, simple and wooden, the kind that looked handcrafted rather than bought. When she opened it, she found a necklace inside, a delicate silver chain with a tiny etched pendant shaped like an old compass, worn and weathered, as if it carried a history all its own. Michael said quietly, "For when you feel lost." The word settled deep into her heart, stirring memories she thought she had sealed away. She didn't know why the gesture moved her so profoundly, but it did. She hugged him without thinking, and he held her as though the world might fall apart if he let go. That night, Claire realized she had crossed the quiet line between companionship and love, though she hadn't intended to. Months passed, and as spring returned to the town, Michael asked her to marry him. It wasn't dramatic or loud, he simply took her hand during an evening walk along the lakeside, where the water reflected the fading orange glow of sunset. He looked at her with an earnestness that steadied her breathing. "I want to build a life with you," he said, "whatever that life becomes." Claire felt a mixture of joy and fear, the kind that comes with choosing a future after loss. She hesitated only long enough to feel her mother's memory settle softly in her heart, reminding her that life doesn't wait for those who hide from it. She said yes, wiping tears from her cheeks before they could fall. Later, she would think back to this moment, to the warmth of his hand and the echo of her own heartbeat, wondering how such a beautiful beginning could lead to something she never could have imagined. The wedding took place on a mild June afternoon, the kind of day when the air felt warm enough to soften even the hardest ache in a person's heart. Claire kept the ceremony small, a few neighbors, distant cousins, and the pastor who had known her since childhood. Michael stood at the altar wearing a suit that looked slightly older in style, as though it had been tailored in another decade, but it suited him. He smiled at her with a warmth that steadied her nerves, and for a moment she felt certain she was making the right choice. When she slipped the old compass pendant beneath her dress, she whispered a silent thank you to her mother, hoping somehow the blessing would carry across worlds. No one noticed that Michael never touched the food at the reception or that he stepped out twice without explanation. People simply assumed he was overwhelmed. Claire didn't question it, not yet. That night, after the last guest left and the final candle flickered down to a stub, Claire and Michael returned to the little house they would now share. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that feels like it's watching you. Claire felt at first, a subtle, uneasy chill that pressed against her skin even though the room was warm. Michael excused himself, saying he needed fresh air, and stepped outside without taking a coat. She waited for him in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, replaying the day in her mind. Minutes passed. Then more. When she finally rose to look for him, she noticed something odd. The window was slightly open, but the curtains weren't moving. Not even the faintest breeze slipped through. For reasons she couldn't explain, her heart began to beat faster, her instincts pressing at her like a quiet alarm she couldn't silence. When Michael returned, something about him felt unfamiliar. His smile was the same, his voice gentle, but there was an emptiness behind his eyes that made Claire's stomach tighten. She sat beside him, trying to shake off the feeling. "Are you all right?" she asked. He nodded slowly, as if the gesture required thought rather than instinct. She tried to focus on normalcy, on the comfort of marriage beginning, but the unease lingered. Later that night, Claire awoke to a faint sound, not footsteps, not breathing, but something like a sigh drifting across the room. She reached out toward Michael's side of the bed, expecting warmth, but the sheets were cold. When she turned on the lamp, the room seemed distorted, shadows stretched longer than they should. In the corner she saw a shape, tall, still, almost familiar, but when she blinked, it was gone. She whispered his name, her voice trembling, but the house swallowed the sound whole. Claire told herself not to panic. People played cruel jokes sometimes, maybe a neighbor's child thought it would be funny, maybe a letter meant for someone else had ended up in her mailbox. She repeated those possibilities over and over, but none of them eased the tightening in her chest. When she stepped back into the house, Michael greeted her with a gentle, almost practiced smile. He asked if she had slept well, as though nothing unusual had happened. His voice was warm, but there was a faint echo beneath it, a hollow undertone she hadn't heard before the wedding. Claire studied him carefully, noticing details she once overlooked, how his skin seemed too cool when she touched his arm, how his breath never left a trace of warmth in the air, how his movements were precise, almost rehearsed. She felt torn between fear and the love she thought she understood, unsure which truth to trust. Days passed, and the tension in the house grew like a quiet weight. Claire tried to maintain a sense of normalcy by opening the bookstore, meeting regular customers, and forcing herself into familiar routines, but her mind never drifted far from Michael's odd behavior. He would disappear for hours, leaving no explanation. When she asked where he'd been, he always answered with vague phrases like, "I was nearby," or "I needed to step out for a moment," though he returned without signs of having been outdoors. Late at night, Claire often awoke to the sensation of someone standing near the edge of the bed, but when she opened her eyes, she saw nothing except the stillness of the room. At first, she blamed stress and exhaustion, but the unease never faded. Instead, it sharpened, making her hyper-aware of her surroundings, her instincts whispering that something inside her home no longer belonged to the world she understood. The turning point came one evening when Claire returned from the bookstore earlier than usual. She called out for Michael, expecting him to appear from the living room or kitchen, but the house remained silent. As she moved toward the hallway, she heard a faint murmuring coming from behind the closed door of their bedroom. The voice was his, soft, steady, but the words were in a language she had never heard before, rhythmic and ancient. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. When she opened the door, the room fell silent instantly. Michael stood near the window, his back turned, his reflection faintly visible in the glass like a blur overlapping the night outside. Claire took a step forward and whispered his name. He turned to her slowly, too slowly, as though his body remembered how to move seconds after his mind did. For the first time since the wedding, she felt truly afraid, her instincts warning her that the man she loved was slipping further from the world she knew, and she no longer understood what he was becoming. Claire reached her breaking point on a night when the house felt colder than the winter air outside. She tried to sleep, hoping exhaustion would numb her fear, but something stirred her awake, a low, aching hum that vibrated through the walls like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. She sat up slowly, breath trembling as the darkness shifted at the far end of the room. Michael stood there, though she hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't felt the bed move. His figure seemed less solid than before, faintly transparent at the edges, as though the shadows were swallowing pieces of him. Claire whispered his name, and for a moment, he looked like the man she had loved, the man who brought her tea, listened to her stories, and made her feel seen. But then he spoke, and his voice carried two tones, layered together. "You are the only warm thing I have known in years." She felt her heart clench, not from fear alone but from sorrow, a sorrow that belonged to him but lived now in her chest. She realized she wasn't just facing something unknown, she was facing a soul aching for a place it no longer had in the living world. Gathering every bit of courage, Claire stepped closer. Her hands shook, but she spoke softly, choosing compassion over terror. "Tell me the truth," she said. Michael's expression faltered. His form flickered like a candle caught between staying lit and burning out. He told her he once lived in the same town long before she was born. He had loved someone deeply, a woman whose face he could barely remember, and when she died unexpectedly, he couldn't let go. He wandered between moments, between memories, unable to cross to whatever waited beyond. Over time, his own name faded, his past blurred, and all that remained was the longing for warmth, for love, for connection. When he first saw Claire in the bookstore, something in her reminded him of the life he once lived, the comfort he once had, and he approached her not as a monster, but as a lost soul searching for home. As he spoke, Claire felt her fear break apart into something far more heartbreaking, empathy. He hadn't misled her out of malice. He had held on to her out of desperation. But love, Claire realized, could not be built on suffering. She saw now that Michael was fading, his form growing weaker each time he stepped into the light. Staying with her was hurting him, tethering him to a world he was no longer meant to walk. Tears stung her eyes as she reached out, her hand passing through the cold mist of his fingers. "You don't have to stay trapped anymore," she whispered. "You deserve peace." For the first time, Michael's expression softened into genuine relief. A quiet, fragile smile rose on his face, a smile that carried gratitude rather than longing. The house grew still. The air warmed. And with a breath that sounded almost human, he whispered, "Thank you for letting me feel alive one last time." Then, slowly, gently, he dissolved into the dimness, like a memory finally allowed to rest. Claire felt the weight lift from the room, leaving behind a silence that no longer frightened her. The weeks that followed were heavy yet strangely calm. Claire reopened her bookstore, moving through her days with a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. She kept the compass pendant near her heart, not as a reminder of fear, but as a reminder of compassion, the kind that holds space for what others cannot say. On some nights, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, letting the moonlight settle around her. She didn't look for Michael's shadow or expect to hear his voice. Instead, she chose to believe he found the peace he longed for, that somewhere beyond human understanding he finally crossed into the warmth he sought for so long. Claire healed slowly, carrying forward the lesson his presence had given her. Sometimes love isn't about holding on, sometimes it's about letting go for the sake of someone else's freedom. And in that choice, she found her own. As you reflect on Claire's story, ask yourself, what would you have done in her place? Could you offer comfort to something you feared? Could you listen to a truth that didn't fit the world you understood? Love, in all its forms, asks us to choose between fear and compassion. And in choosing compassion, Claire discovered a strength she never knew she had. Before you go, let us know in the comments how this story made you feel, and what you think you would have done if you were standing in Claire's shoes. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next story, because the tales we share here may remind you that the world is far bigger, and far more mysterious, than we often allow ourselves to believe.